15 years, Tim has performed his very first one-man play, Moliere Than Thou, over 500 times, giving some 100,000 students their first introduction to Moliere, and he actually did it on the stage once. He also presents one monologue from every Shakespeare play in his one-man show, A Lot of Shakespeare, along with his collection of some of the most amazing speeches ever in The Greatest Speech of All Time. Tim is the former founder and editor of the Script Review, and also the former artistic director of Chicago Stage 2 Theater, where he produced nearly 50 plays in 5 years, including many new versions of the plays of Moliere featuring his impish sense of rhyme. These 17 iambic pentameter variations of plays, most published by Playscripts Incorporated, have been produced over 150 times around the world. So we have to give a little bit of thanks. All of Tim's workshops and shows while here are funded by monies from the Missouri Arts Council, a state agency, and the College of Arts and Sciences, and we thank them for their support. So please, let's give a warm welcome to my friend and a friend of our program, an artist and road warrior supreme, Tim Mooney.
Thank you very much. Are you all secure with me not having a mask on from this distance? Okay, I'm just going to get rid of this. So this is a brand new workshop for me. I've never given this one before, so I'm a little nervous. I didn't realize this was a playwriting group that I was going to be speaking to until about 4 days ago, I think. And then I was like, oh, how do I talk about playwriting without cannibalizing from the performance I'm giving tomorrow afternoon, which is a lot about playwriting. And I was thinking that, and what do I even know about playwriting? Because I kind of have a career in which I backed into it. I didn't do it from taking, I took playwriting analysis classes, and I made it halfway through a playwriting class where I was going to have to write a one-act play once, and as I realized that the deadline on the one-act play was looming and I didn't have any idea how I was going to squeeze it in, I dropped the class. So, what I've done is I've typed something up very quickly, and I've fed it into a prompting machine here. And so I'm going to start with that, but I'm going to pause from time to time to check in on any questions and go from there. But anyway, so what I ultimately decided was, why don't I just get real with you guys and talk with you about what it is that I do, how I do it, and what it means to me, or what demands a career as a playwright seems to take out of me. So, I have one of those weird, evolving careers that has taken me from acting to directing to literary management to playwriting to producing. I'm an actor first, director second, play analyst, literary manager third, playwright fourth, producer fifth. And I now spend my career sliding up and down that ladder, constantly changing hats without really noticing any more than I'm changing them. I've come to realize that if I was to give an actual title to what it is that I do, it would be turning ideas into words and words into performances. The more appropriate term, catch-all term on all of this would probably be artist, though the word artist always sounds really pretentious to me. But perhaps it's someone who does anything and everything it takes to put thoughts out into the universe, which is sometimes glamorous, but more often very pedestrian. Section number 1, having conversations with yourself. A playwright is a person who has a conversation with himself ongoingly, probably all day, all night, all the time. Conversations might go as, which is better, Tim, this or this? How did we end up here? How might all of this go horribly wrong? What would it look like if it did go horribly wrong? What does the world need to focus its attention on? How is this seemingly inconsequential thing a sign of some pending huge impact? How might this idea be realized in the depiction of a human being? How might two people have a conversation about this thing in a way that would represent both sides of that opinion? So you can probably see in there, that's the kind of conversations playwrights have to engage in all the time in the back of your head. If you are willing to engage in that conversation in the back of your head a lot, you're through step one. But part of the problem is that we, as human beings, as individuated personages, want to wrong ourselves for having that conversation. I.e., there's something wrong with me for obsessing on this thing from so many different angles. There's something wrong about me for thinking this thing to begin with. I grew up in a Catholic family. They can find unlimited number of ways to make your thinking wrong. If an idea gets hold of you that you can't shake loose of, you got to realize you're probably not the only one who is thinking about that thing. Other people might be grateful to see that idea codified and realized in a shape that expresses it. Your greatest challenge is to embrace the wrongness of it, get over the voices telling you that you should not express that thing, and capture that thing. Because if it's got that big of a hold on you, it's probably a very powerful thing to think. And guess what? You can always tear it up later, or leave it sitting on a shelf, or tuck it into a folder on your computer. About 6 months ago, a friend of mine reminded me of a story that I had written about 15 years ago that I just happened to give to him to read in the very brief window of time in which I was actually allowing myself to show it to people. And I was never really satisfied with the story. I had left it in a folder on my computer, but it just so happened that I was working on a half-hour slot for a fringe festival. If we have time later on, I have a lot to say on the topic of fringe festivals, but we'll see how we're doing. But that fringe festival, I had already planned using 2 10-minute pieces that I had performed back in 2012 and 2013. So I went back and read, but this thing that he reminded me of seemed to be on a very similar thing. So I went back and reread it aloud, and it was 60 minutes long. And it just kind of unraveled as it went. It got worse and worse as it went. But I remember the very opening was a kind of a solid idea that I liked. And I wanted to go back and rewrite it and refinish it. So I just went back and cut out all but the first 5 minutes, and then added about 1.5 minutes more from the other 55 minutes that were there to make this thing into a more compact thing that would fill out that half hour that I was working on. And so where did I go? So it became monologue number 3 of the one-man play that is in continuous development currently, which I call Tim's Paranoid Delusions. That's Tim's with a Z and delusions with a Z. So just an example of something that makes you feel wrong. Section number 2, psychological balance. It's not a small thing to work past everything that's inside you that screams wrong. That's wrong for you to do, wrong for you to think, wrong for you to write. As I mentioned, I grew up in a Catholic family. I also had 3 elder brothers, at least one of whom thought I was his personal punching bag. It is not in any way, a small thing, to get past whatever voices are living inside you, perhaps a product of your parents or your teachers or your friends who say that you should not be thinking these things. It takes a lot of psychological health and an ever-renewing psychological growth to look into those dark places, see what it all means, capture it on paper, and put it before an audience to let them judge it. To get to that place is a ton of work, and it is a ton of work on yourself, and it never ends. Your job as a writer is to be able to replace those wrong voices with yes voices, and then to take a stand for that yes again and again and again. So my biggest project in terms of standing up in front of people, expressing something, whatever that might be, as an actor and a writer, and usually both, is to work on me. There is a daily phase in my work in which I look inward, finding inspiration just as a human being, drawing inspiration for my own purpose, for what I want to accomplish, or what impact I want to make on the planet at large. And it's largely reflected in some of what you might call therapy. Some artists may go see a shrink on a regular basis. I never imagined that I could afford one. So I cobbled together my own growth programs. I've worked with support groups, personal growth groups, people whose ideas I trust, and more. There are a few books that have been key. I'm pretty sure Kat has probably mentioned the book The Artist Way at some point or another. I have never read it, but when I learned about it, I found that I was largely doing that program already. Back around 1997, I wrote a novel, a very personal novel, which I called Reality Refused. It was really just kind of catching up on my life until now, expressing all of that I had been going through for the past 35 or so years. Mostly writing about the girls that I'd had crushes on. I've only shared that novel with less than a handful of people. It was really about getting that stuff out of me so that I could move on. Once that was complete, I didn't want to let go of the narrative, so every week over the course of the year 1998, I wrote about the week gone by, and I called it 52 Weeks. Still a lot of stuff about girls. When 52 Weeks was complete, I still wanted to maintain the narrative, but I didn't want to be so tied to sitting down every week to work. So I began a piece that I called 12 Months, in which I would let a month go by and then spend the first week of the following month writing about the month gone by. When the year 2000 rolled around, I didn't want to lose that was the year 2000, yes. Once that was done, I realized that I was missing, sorry, skipped a year. After the 12-month book, I decided, look, I'm just going to go through the entire year, and then I'm going to write a book called A Year. And I'm going to spend the month of January writing my book called A Year. And so I gave myself that whole year without having to do that kind of structured writing. Once that was done, I realized that I was missing the discipline of doing something on a more regular basis. A lot of this, if you haven't noticed already, is about discipline. And so I challenged myself to a project that would engage me on a daily basis. I wrote the lyrics to a new song every day on a daily basis for 365 days. I called that work 365 Songs. Some of those were pretty terrific. I was proud of how I was able to come up with something new every day, but it was exhausting. So I took a year off and then came back and did it again. I did one song a day for 365 days. The skill came back to me like magic. I left my daily, weekly, monthly, annual projects behind at that point because by then I was on to something else. I was in the thick of this tour, which you see me on now. I'm just coming off of an 8-month break from that tour, but I'm back. I will give you the story of how all that got underway at tomorrow's performance of Lost at Santa's Village, which is, what time is that at? Do you remember? 2 o'clock, 2 p.m., right back here, which is another kind of a one-man show. But you should know that a year later, I went back and mined my favorite songs out of those 730 songs to send to a composer who wanted to collaborate on something, and he put some of my favorite songs to music, sent them back to me as MP3s, and I assembled those into a one-man play which I called Karaoke Nights, a one-man rock opera. I sing karaoke. And so I would find myself writing songs late at night at the karaoke bar because I had to finish the song before I went to sleep, and sometimes that was torture. But all of that writing was just one example of me working on me. I was doing other stuff. I was doing weekend-long seminars with support groups. I was reading a book from Louise Hay called You Can Heal Your Life, which I recommend to anybody. It taught me the value of affirmations, things that I could repeat to myself on a daily basis to remind me of the value of what I have to offer to the world, to counter the negative messages that I'd kind of absorbed as a child. So here's an example of something that I now say to myself on a daily basis. This is a quote from, this is a quote from Louise Hay. I am willing to release, and by the way, with any of these affirmations, just hear it for yourself in terms of, if I said this to myself on a daily basis, what might be possible? I'm willing to release the need to be unworthy. I am worthy of the very best in life, and I now lovingly allow myself to accept it. My outer effects of procrastination automatically begin to fade as I no longer feel the need to delay my good. I've come across lots of resources, such as Louise Hay, over the years. Another one that I've discovered much more recently is a book called Die Empty by Todd Hendry. As I read that book, I gathered like a couple of hundred affirmations on my laptop that I transcribed onto a list. That list was about 13 pages long, and I would speak those 13 pages to myself every morning, and I would cross out and erase the ones that weren't really engaging me. So I got the list down to about a total of 50 or so affirmations that really reminded me of how I wanted to go about attacking my day. One of them was a favorite quote from playwright George Bernard Shaw. I'd stumbled across it years before, but now I decided it was time to memorize it. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die. For the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is sort of a splendid torch that I have got hold of for the moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations. I won't make you listen to the whole list of 50 affirmations that I explore every day now, but let me just share a few of them with you to give you an idea. And if you listen to these, perhaps ask how you might feel about yourself if you said this to yourself on a day-in, day-out basis. I am willing to step into the heart of uncertainty, find my voice, and commit myself to battles worth fighting. My greatest opportunities appear in the course of me taking action. My uncertainty only reminds me that I am engaging in important and valuable work. I define the battles I need to fight each day and make meaningful progress. Now, when I hit that one in the course of reciting these to myself every morning, I immediately go over to my little notebook here, in which I write up my daily to-do list. So this one said, I define the battles I need to fight each day and make meaningful progress. So I go and I write all the things that I intend to accomplish this day. Most of those things are copied over from the page from yesterday that I never got around to doing. But I copy them over again and again and again, and sometimes I cross them out. Like, let me just go through a few of these. 10, 29, 20. Email, arrow 150. The objective is to get the emails on that computer in the inbox down under 150. That's on my list every day, and I never achieve it. MC, Man Cave, LASV, Lost at Santa's Village, TPD, Tim's Paranoid Delusions, 2X. I want to run through all of those things 2 times so that my mouth gets into the rhythm of delivering them. Here's one. I can cross this one out. Playwriting workshop. What else? You might find this curious. New Hampshire English and History. I have databases of faculty throughout the country. Some of them are English teachers and history teachers, and I'm transferring those onto an Excel document so it's no longer torture to send out to all of them. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Virginia environmental teachers. The play that I'm doing tonight is environmentally oriented, and those teachers need to know about it, and so I'm emailing. In fact, I've already emailed today to Pennsylvania and Virginia. I also did, I did Delaware and Washington, D.C., actually. But anyway, you get the idea. So what work am I willing to suffer for today? What is this project aspiring to become? Sometimes you want to work on something and you got an idea and it's stuck inside your head and you gotta do some work on it, but the project has a life of its own and it wants to be something. The form that it ultimately takes, in my instance, maybe a one-man play, maybe an essay, maybe a Facebook post, I don't know what, but you need to sometimes listen for what the project wants to do. I choose growth over safety and empty myself of my best work. I'm a legit expert. I make career breakthroughs on a daily basis. People fight to get me. My most obvious ideas are often deeply profound to others. I am paid for what I do by who I get to become. I expect the best while actively working to bring it about. I spend my life building a body of work I am proud of. Today is all that I have. So that's just a snapshot of some of those things. I mix all of this in with a daily discipline of meditation, exercises, dancing, push-ups, planks, curls, sit-ups, and catching up on a few news programs. In addition to pumping myself up into a state of creativity, both as an actor and a writer, I also want to take in what's going on in the world around me. I'm a bit of a news junkie, often following politics and contemplating its consequences. You'll see that in tonight's play, at the very least. If you come to see Man Cave, a one-man sci-fi climate change tragic comedy, and you'll probably walk away from that with a good idea of what my politics actually are. All right, we come to the act of writing. There's a couple, I put writing into 2 kind of specific buckets, though I never think about those buckets while I'm doing it. One of those buckets is developing technique. Now that bucket might include all of those writing projects that I just listed out to you. One of them is my work on the French playwright Molière. I take Molière's plays and rewrite them into English. Molière's a French playwright from the 17th century. I rewrite them into English rhymed iambic pentameter. So that's a highly technical piece of writing where every syllable counts, where every line ends in a rhyme. So the average play of his that I would rewrite might have 2,000 lines of iambic pentameter, each couplet rhyming within itself. There was a time when I've written a series of newsletters. I wrote the newsletter for the Illinois Theater Association, their quarterly newsletter. I wrote a newsletter called The Script Review, in which I would review new manuscripts. See, I've worked as a literary manager variously at the Seattle Rep and the Milwaukee Rep, and I've decided to find a way to write reviews that I could distribute to a bunch of theaters, perhaps to help those playwrights network a little more. I wrote 700 of those reviews over 7 years, I think over 33 issues, each issue 10 pages long, each issue containing reviews on 20 scripts, I believe. And so there was a very rigid manner that I had to squeeze a certain amount of information into this column and that column. And so I picked up a lot of discipline about being able to describe a plot in an extremely short period of time, or short space. I wrote a newsletter. I ran a theater called the Stage 2 Theater, and I wanted to do a newsletter for that theater, and I called it Two News, spelled T-W-O-N-W-O-S. Now, very few people got that joke. I was joking about the spelling of the word two being T-W-O, which happens to rhyme with news, so I spelled news N-W-O-S. I think I pissed a lot of people off with that joke because either they didn't get it or they thought that nobody would get it. Given that I was running my own theater and we specialized in producing new work, every once in a while I would strong-arm them into producing a play that I had written. And when we decided to produce a 17th century play by Molière called Tartuffe, I decided to attempt to write a new version of the play in rhyming verse. It went really well. I quit running the theater and started writing new versions of the plays of Molière in rhymed iambic pentameter. I'm up to 17 of them published, some of them in full length and some of them in shortened 40-minute variations. But most of them have been published. In fact, this school, Northwest Missouri State University, eventually produced my Tartuffe maybe a dozen years ago, I think. But this was not original writing. This was disciplined writing. This was analyzing somebody else's work and making it my own, adding flourishes, jokes, things that made me laugh. I am never more gratified than when something that I came up with makes other people laugh, because quite often it's something that I wrote at 2 in the morning and cracked up laughing with no one to hear. But I can expect that you can see by now the kind of discipline that went into making me a writer. It's something that I'm kind of driven to do. I often dread sitting down to actually do the work, but once I do sit down to actually do the work, it doesn't feel like work anymore. It feels like expression, getting something off of my chest and out of my system. I didn't do all of this to develop discipline, but I would not have the kind of discipline that I have had I not pushed past my own resistance and done all these things. So, I think I said already, I turn ideas into words and words into performances. Sometimes I would add this technique to these already standing stories, such as the plays of Molière, In doing this plays of Moliere, I created for myself something that I call my rhyming dictionary, in which as I'm trying to come up with a rhyme, I know what I want the punchline word to be, because I know that word's going to be the payoff. Let's see. Let me think of this line from The Misanthrope is kind of representative of the kind of rhymes that I write. The honor with which you endear me thusly is one which I would take quite seriously. I try to find the rhyme that you don't hear coming, so that it'll be a little surprise to you with every other line that you hear, because the first line sets it up, and so I knew that the word that I'm working towards is seriously, and then I look to find the rhyming word. Now, sometimes as I'm making my rhyming dictionary, I'm typing seriously, thusly, fussly, and so I just type out whatever seems to be a word there until I've got a series of words, and then the next time I'm looking for a word, something to rhyme seriously, all I have to do is Control find seriously, and it'll bring up all the words that rhyme with seriously. So anyway, more technique and discipline. Sometimes my writing is inspired by a moment in which I go, huh, that's weird. I think it was Isaac Asimov once wrote that the greatest scientific discoveries of all time were not written or were not created by someone who says, Eureka! Most of them are made by a scientist who goes, huh, that's weird. Part of your task as a writer is paying attention to things and absorbing what's going on in the outside world. This is mostly about filling my head with stuff, paying attention to the political world, reading, studying, absorbing, developing opinions on things, looking at weird stuff that we take for granted. What I want to do at the end of this event here is I want to share with you a weird thing that's something you all probably take for granted at this point. It's a little performance piece that's part of Tim's Paranoid Delusions. It's 10 minutes long, and I think it will kind of coalesce a lot of these ideas that I'm expressing into a form that'll give you a different understanding of it. I notice things that don't seem to fit, things that aren't quite right. I look at weird stuff that we take for granted. Here's a series of ideas that I got caught me up enough that I turned them into a play. I never know if something is going to make a good play. I never know where the idea is going to go. I feel something strongly. I have a sense of something that is wrong with the world, and that all of this could go sideways as a result. I then sit down to capture it. I'm always totally surprised when the plot takes a turn that I didn't see coming. I don't know if any of you were around here 2 or 3 years ago when Sean Murphy did a performance called Criteria. A couple of nods there. I wrote Criteria as a short story, and I got I sent it off to, it didn't start out as a one-man anything, it was a short story. But I sent it off to Isaac Asimov's Science Fiction and Fantasy magazine. And I heard back from them, and they was really complimentary about the work, but they didn't want to publish it. So ultimately, I turned it into a one-man show. I go into that again in my other play. But Criteria is kind of about terrorism. I wrote it in 2002, so most people assume that it's mostly to do with 9/11. It doesn't have that much to do with 9/11. I had a side job when I was back from the road, back in Chicago. I worked as what we call a standardized patient. I don't know if anybody of you ever heard of a standardized patient, but standardized patients are actors who play the role of patients in order to help train doctors in med school. And so by the time I got done with my spring tour, for instance, I would find myself back in Chicago with a little extra time on my hands, and it was about time for finals week at the med school, and so they would bring me in for the doctor's final to play the role, and the doctor's final was delivering bad news. And so I had to listen again and again, as many as 80 times, to the news that I had pancreatic cancer and 6 months to live. I would have to hear that like 80 times through the course of a week. Now, to distract myself from that, I started writing a story. And what gave me the idea from the story is the doctors would, at the end of their conversation with me, they would hand me their card. It was their card. It wasn't really their card. It was symbolic of what their card would be with their name and their social security number on it. They would leave the examination room. I would sit down to one of those forms that you fill in the bubbles with pencil, and the first thing I would fill in would be their name and their social security number. And I started to notice things about social security numbers. We were in Chicago, and about 75% of those numbers began with the digit 3. And I thought that was really odd, because every once in a while somebody would come in and it would start with a 1, or a 2, or a 4, or a 5. And that was pretty much the range. Some might be a 0. But I wondered why I was seeing such a preponderance of 3s and so little of anything else. Again, it's just that's weird. And I looked it up, and I realized that Social Security numbers are assigned to you based on what area you are living in when you apply for it. 3s are in Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Crazy curious fact. But I took that crazy curious fact and I put it together with thoughts that I'd been having about terrorism, thoughts that I've had about the surveillance state, and how everyone was now having to show their driver's license even just to go into a building. In downtown Chicago, if I wanted to go into an office building, I had to stop at the desk and show them my driver's license before I could get passed through a scanner. So those thoughts were very much in everyone's mind shortly after 9/11. Probably as I say this, most of you weren't born then. But it was a thing. And I was also really concerned about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because it was never ending, and it always seemed they were always at battle with each other, with one sucking up more and more of the territory of the others. So I took all those thoughts, put them into a blender, created a story of how all this could really get itself screwed up. Like, if they took that Social Security number and rather than having it as a card that everyone had to carry around with them, they made it a tattoo on your hand so that no one could steal your number or you couldn't pretend to be somebody other than who you were. And then I put that into a mix of what if prejudice as we know it went away, because over 200-300 years, with intermarrying and everything, everyone would just kind of be this nice cream chocolate color. So there was nothing more to be prejudiced about anymore, except now you've got that number on your hand. And suddenly, numberism replaces racism. Somebody once said, if everyone was suddenly lost their sense of racism, they would find something to replace it immediately. Anyway, so I put that into the future, and it became my science fiction, speculative fiction piece. Now, I didn't anticipate the turns that this would take when I started out writing this. I was writing this during 5-minute breaks in between doctors as a standardized patient. So in 5 minutes, I might write a paragraph. But I kept coming back to it and kept coming back to it, and it developed into, 20, 30-page thing eventually. And I finalized it as a story, eventually turned it into a one-man play. But at one point, the character himself, who's traveling from the east to the west because he's carrying a nuclear device, which he's going to blow up a train that's coming from west to east to return all of the nuclear waste to the east. You don't need to understand all this for it to matter. But at one point, I found myself writing the line as he's going to stop in a diner finally, treat himself to a meal, he says to himself, "I had no idea of the consequences of such a stop." Having written that, I'm like, oh, now I have to write consequences. And that led me to a very funny scene in that diner, followed by a very exciting, thrilling climax to the play. But once I had written that line, everything went from there. So it helps, I suppose, to outline where you see your plot is going, but it also helps to notice how one line leads you to the next and the next and the next. Couple more examples. The one that I want to share with you is called Electric Eye. And it's how electric eyes have such a, how omniscient they are now in our lives. And I don't want to tell you any particular details about it, but it's about cameras, and it becomes about drones. And I didn't, all I had was a couple of ideas about feeling really weird about everyone being under surveillance all the time, and I wanted to say something about that. And it kind of took its own route. I have another piece from Tim's Delusions called The Dog That Doesn't Bark. I had a hold of a couple of facts, like the Bush-Gore conflict from 2000. You're probably hearing a lot about that right now, aren't you, in 2020? Because the decision of Bush versus Gore, where the Supreme Court stepped in and big-footed the election, is kind of what we're looking at as what might actually happen right now. And so I had that I've been carrying, I think a lot of the division that we have right now as a country stems from the year 2000 and that decision for the Supreme Court to step in and bigfoot that election. 3 of the participants on behalf of, working on behalf of George Bush, by the way, are now sitting on the Supreme Court. Perhaps you've heard that already. But around that same time, I was thinking about Colin Powell at the UN insisting that those trailers in the desert were mobile chemical weapons labs, and that the aluminum cylinders from Niger were nuclear acceleration tubes, and now I'm thinking about Lindsey Graham entirely changing his personality over the last 4 years. And I found myself questioning how many of these things might actually be attributed to someone getting blackmailed. And so I wrote a play about blackmail, and that's The Dog That Doesn't Bark. I wrote one, I already told you about the one called The Company. I don't know if I told you the title was The Company, but that one's about monopolies. And in the future, when every single company has merged into one, and it's just a single monopoly controlling everything. So you can see why these are Tim's paranoid delusions. Okay, my iPad just stopped working. Excuse me a second. I'm going to pick up the story here, but we're gonna take a couple different tracks here. Da 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 da. Okay, so a couple of other things that I'm working on currently, really. Well, there's Man Cave. Let me pick it up with Man Cave. Man Cave is the one I'm going to be performing tonight. The idea for that one came to me when, for 17 years, 20 years really, I've been touring my one-man shows to schools around the country. I've been referred to as a road warrior. I put about 40,000 miles on the car every year. This is the first year that I won't hit that mark because we've all been sheltering in place for so long. But I have felt the preponderance of guilt through the course of that, knowing that my carbon exhaust is contributing to climate change. And I knew climate change was a thing, and I know it's serious, and I have been purposefully ignoring it, maybe contributing to carbon offsets here and there, but the guilt was building up. And then I saw somebody do a one-man play about climate change, kind of talking from the present about a future in which climate change arrives. And his depiction of what we were facing was so frightening that I felt like I had to do something about it. But other people around me weren't that frightened. The people, as I could feel in the room, as I was watching this one-man play with another, let's say, 24 people who were sitting watching it with me, I could feel their resistance. They didn't want to believe that this was all going to go down so quickly and so badly in such a brief period of time. And I realized that they were sitting in their disbelief because they were all, they'd all heard that it was only going to take 50, 100 years. And as long as this guy was just talking about an abstract future in which all this goes down really badly, really fast, they were going to resist it. And so seeing somebody else's one-man play about climate change gave me an idea for a one-man play about climate change. I decided, what if I go into the future, and it's now science fiction, not talking about a potential future, but being in an actual future in which somebody who's lived through climate change talks about how we got here. And so people have a natural tendency to accept a human being who's living in a situation, and they go along with that notion and are generally willing to accept anything that a sympathetic character might want to express. But then they accumulate the knowledge of just how we got to that point, and suddenly they're much more worked up about climate change and wanting to do something about it. So that was a big, just gonna close out of that and go back to there. So that was a big thing for me, and I wrote this in 2018. I wrote it in 2017. The first performance was in 2018, and already several of the things that I made up in 2017 have come true. I'm not saying that it's all going to come true or that I had this vision of the future, but forest fires in California is just an example of some of the things that have come true. So that was one idea that caught me up. Another that caught me up is the idea that the man named Shakespeare probably did not write the plays that we attribute to the man named Shakespeare. Now, I saw someone doing a one-man play on this, in fact. But this is not a one-man play that I'm describing here. Keir Cutler, an actor from Canada, has a show called Is Shakespeare Dead? It's based on a Mark Twain story called Is Shakespeare Dead? And it goes into the possibility that this man named Shakespeare never could possibly have had the kind of outrageous education, connections, resources to create the plays of Shakespeare that we now attribute to him. So I have been a Shakespeare skeptic for the last, say, 15 years. About 5-6 years ago, a friend of mine, and I had no idea, who might be a candidate for that human being, but about 5-6 years ago, a friend of mine introduced me to a potential that Shakespeare's works might have been written by a woman. And that, my first response to that was, a woman couldn't do that. And then I was like, why wouldn't a woman be able to do that? And rather than the other candidates for who wrote Shakespeare, a woman would have greater motive. Anybody who has seen Shakespeare in Love knows that women weren't allowed to perform on stage. There were lots of restrictions about women and the vulgar theater that they were not allowed to do. And so, and the candidate that was suggested in this book that my friend recommended was Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke. Mary Sidney's two sons went on to become earls themselves in the highest positions in Elizabethan politics. And if it had been discovered that their mother was writing for the vulgar theater, it would have cut their personal wealth down hugely. It would be, equivalent today would be somebody who was a multi-billionaire who would lose most of their billions. And so, for once, there was motive on the part, because people would say, maybe it was Ben Jonson, maybe it was Spencer or Fletcher or Christopher Marlowe, and there's always reasons why it didn't work out from them. But this is one that there's very little reason why it could not have been her. So I was now looking at this, I was going to write a one-woman play. So finally, I wasn't writing for myself. It would be someone else who would need to do it. But I wrote it as a long monologue, and it bored me to death, much less anybody else. And so I started adding in plays so that she would have some confrontation between Mary Sidney and Queen Elizabeth, between Mary Sidney and her son. And so I had these nice confrontation scenes in there, but I needed someone that she could talk to who was not the audience, who would be on her side. And I realized that Mary Sidney, after her husband died, fell in love with the doctor on her estate, and they had a long decade or two together before she passed away. Anyway, so I then put the doctor into the thing. And so I now have a 5-person play called Thy Will, what is it? Or, I forgot the subtitle. Thy Will, or The Great Beard of Avon. And Shakespeare, in this scenario, is actually an actor who works with the company on the Pembroke estate, Pembroke's Men, who picks up the manuscript and delivers it to the producers or to the publishers, and little by little starts sneaking his name onto the front page. So anyway, this is just an example of an idea that captures me. One more, the next one-man play that I hope to do at some point is going to be called I, Asimov. I'm a huge Isaac Asimov fan. I've read hundreds of his books. I'm captured by, and some of his ideas are actually going to appear in the play tonight. 3 Laws of Robotics he created. And I realized that Asimov's 100th birthday, I realized this almost 2 years ago, Asimov's 100th birthday was coming up January 2nd, 2020. And so I went back to his 3rd autobiography, started cutting it down so that I could recite the essential content of it in 2 hours. And so that, I haven't even begun memorizing that one, but that's going to be my next one-man play. So when I play the roles in my plays, as both the actor and the writer, I edit over and over and over again. I cannot make it through the recitation of a single show without rewriting something. And every time I go back to it, I find an easier way to say that thing. And I find that this word I have automatically replaced with this other word. And so whatever I put out there first is not my final product. I wrote an acting textbook called Acting at the Speed of Life, Conquering Theatrical Style. When I hit draft number 26, I was finally ready to hit the publish button. When I first wrote Man Cave, the one I'm doing tonight, it was 90 minutes long. The first time I read it to someone out loud, it was about 10 o'clock at night when I started, and she was sitting across the kitchen table from me and kept dozing off through the course of my recitation. And I was like, okay, we're going to cut the heck out of this one. It turned out that, and this is another thing about fringe festivals, by the way. Often when I'm doing a fringe festival, it's a 1-hour limit. I have 1 hour, I have 10 minutes to move my show in, I have 60 minutes to perform, I have 10 minutes to move my show out because there's another production coming in to perform in the next hour. And so I need to chip away and chip away and chip away at anything superfluous until I get something that's like compact like a diamond. And so Man Cave not only needed to get down to 60 minutes for fringe festivals, but there was another festival out in Los Angeles where they were doing 3 programs in a night as part of the same thing. I needed to get it down to 45 minutes. And so I kept chipping and chipping and chipping as I memorized and memorized and memorized. So probably the best way to improve your writing, memorize it, or attempt to memorize it, or recite it enough that it becomes like memorizing. When I wrote my Molière scripts, I was writing for sometimes casts of 12 to 17. But when I started auditioning to be in those plays, I ended up getting cast in the roles that Molière himself originally played, which is why it eventually led to a play called Molière Then Thou, my one-man show that I've toured around the country. And so Molière wrote the hardest roles for himself, because he knew the challenge to which he would need to rise. And so I would memorize these extremely difficult roles, and as I memorize, I'm rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. And so the best written roles in all of the Molière plays that I've written are always the ones that I ended up playing myself, because they got extra attention. So that ends that portion of the program. I just want to talk a little bit about marketing, because it's one thing to write a play, it's another thing to get it out there. I was writing plays when I was running a theater, so I could get them onto the stage, but when I stopped running that theater, then I didn't have that easy access to a stage. And so what you always hear, I'm sure you've heard this a million times, is it's not what you know, it's who you know. And I have found that some of my best career accomplishments have come about because I met somebody somewhere. So for instance, as I promote my one-man shows, I go to the Southeast Theater Conference. I might go to the Illinois Theater Association, Virginia Theater Association. There's too many to even remember where I've been to. International Thespians, which had been in Lincoln, Nebraska, and is now going to Bloomington, Indiana. But so I would get a booth at those things, and I would set up all my various scripts, banners about the shows that I'm putting on, and I'd be there present in my booth. Sometimes, one of the things I do just to catch student attention is I have a bingo cage that I put out on a table, and they can spin it, and out a ping pong ball comes out, and it will say Hamlet, for instance, and I will perform a monologue from Hamlet. So I have 44 balls in the bingo cage, and which correspond to 44 monologues in my head, and I would perform the monologue that comes up, and they would be astonished and surprised. And maybe in the booth next to me would be the folks from Play Scripts Incorporated, which is, there's some major ones that have been around forever: Dramatist Play Service, Dramatic Publishing, Samuel French. If you've done any theater, you've probably carried those scripts around in your back pocket. But Playscripts Incorporated was kind of new on the scene about 15 years ago, and they would be hawking their scripts, and I would be hawking my shows, and when there was nobody around, we would get to know each other, and at one point, I got their catalog in the mail, and I realized this is kind of slick. You know, they may be a startup, but they're going somewhere, and so I wrote them and asked if they might be interested in taking a look at some of my plays. And they already knew who I was, so I knew that they knew I wasn't some crazy idiot playwright who was going to try to push a crappy play on them. And they said, sure, send it our way, and I sent them stuff, and they have ultimately published 15 of my scripts, many of which have never been produced, or had never been produced up until then. There's still one or two that have not been produced. They're just waiting for somebody to find them. And then Playscripts changed management so that they're not so much interested in Molière anymore, but another group has come along, Stage Right, I think, and they've picked up 2 other of my scripts. But again, I got to know them at a conference. So number one is, you know, as a writer, you're not necessarily a social animal. You're in your little bubble working by yourself and won't necessarily interact with other people around you very much, which is healthy for the process of writing, but not healthy in the process of getting things produced. So, you know, and sometimes it's a matter of going and volunteering at your local theater, getting to know the directors there, working as an actor, saying, hey, would you mind looking at my script while I'm here? That sort of thing, there's a balance between being isolated and being social that you kind of have to strike if you ever want to do anything other than a one-man play. There was another point I was going to make. I think it's probably here. Oh, yes, marketing. And other various opportunities are going to come up. A couple of these plays I was talking about under Tim's Paranoid Delusions is because some people from the Minnesota Fringe Festival had been to see 3 or 4 of the shows that I'd brought there over the years, and they were creating something called Fringe Orphans, which was going to be a set of brief 10-minute things or less than 10-minute things that didn't fit in any other performance thing. They wanted like a monologue here or a dance here or a pantomime routine there. And so he invited me to create something for Fringe Orphans, and I created Electric Eye and The Dog That Doesn't Bark. But that's, again, something, those pieces would not be in the world today had somebody not said, do you got anything like this that you might be able to do for this event that we're doing? So some of those things just happen in getting to know people, circulating, being out there present in the theatrical universe. One other thing I want to make sure I covered. There is a listserv out there called Playwright Binge. And it's now grown, I've been with it for maybe 15 years now, but it's grown to about, I don't know, 1,000 or 2,000 members receiving their emails on a regular basis. And twice a year, the month of September and the month of March, they do a project whereby we challenge each other to submit plays to theaters, to conferences, to festivals, to directors, to go out and volunteer at a theater and meet somebody, to get an interview with somebody, to do something in the realm of marketing on a daily basis for a full month. 30 pieces of pushing your material out into the universe. And we share opportunities, and we say, oh, here's a listing for a theater that's looking for a play in Pasadena about paranoid delusions. I don't know. But there's always something. And quite often they're looking for playwrights of color or female playwrights, or you can just see it's a category you don't belong in, so you grind your teeth and move on. But what they've established, and the guy who runs this listserv, Patrick Gaybridge, established that the more you submit, the more you get produced. There's like a one-to-one correlation. That you're going to get shut down, you're going to get rejected. That's a given. Not everybody's going to accept your work. Not everybody's going to read your work with a friendly eye. Not everybody's going to be receptive to your point of view. But there is a predictability in numbers. If I send out 30 plays in the course of a month, I might get ultimately 2 productions out of it, 3 or 5 productions out of it, who knows? But it's that consistency of willing to accept the no responses and move on. And just kind of take that, some of those affirmations that I was reading you is, one of them, I probably didn't read it, this one is fail more. Only by failing on a repeated basis can you ever eventually break through. So if you have a fear of failure and you turn back at the first sign of resistance, then you don't give yourself the opportunity to break through. Let me take a pause here and wrap up this part of the conversation. First to check in, I've just thrown a lot of stuff out at you to see if there's questions. Anything that has you curious, that I've touched upon?
This might be a little hard to answer, but what would you name specifically as your draw to one-man shows?
That I will be performing tomorrow, but I draw, and as I perform that, what I do is I draw a connection. Well, there's another thing. First of all, one-man shows have an economy of their own. I don't have to pay anyone else, and sometimes I don't get paid, but I'm putting my work out there on a regular basis. I'm out on the road. I only have to worry about housing and food for myself. I don't feel guilty about putting someone else through the torture that I'm willing to endure because I'm putting my own ideas that I'm really excited about doing. So there's a lot of psychological, financial stuff surrounding that. But on a really primal basis, for one-man shows, I get a lot of attention. And I realize that more and more over the years, and what I'm going to talk about in Lost at Santa's Village is that what I crave is attention. So while I may fear standing up in front of people and giving an impromptu talk, I really love the fact that everyone is looking in my direction and listening to what I have to say. So that's just skimming the surface, but there's more there. Anything else? All right, well, let me share this performance piece with you. I need to reboot this little prompter thing to be able to do this. This is called Electric Eye. It runs about 10 minutes, and that should leave us with about 10 minutes afterwards to see if you've got other questions or if this brings up questions of its own. Hang on a sec. And let's do this. I never know how this thing wants to bend. There we go. And I've so far, since I first performed this back in 2012, I think it was, I performed it in the round, which was crazy. Never perform a one-man show in the round if you can help it. But also, since then, when I started reviving this a couple months back, I'm now performing almost everything that I do online. So I'm used to just sitting at the desk now and looking at the camera. We'll see how this goes. I can recall my fascination early in life with the self-opening door at the grocery store. The customer would step onto a small rubber mat in front of the door, and in response to pressure sensors that lay beneath it, the door would magically swing open. Somewhere in there, pressure-sensitive mats were replaced with light-sensitive electric eyes. The door would sense the figure of a person approaching, which would trigger the opening. Cool technology, man moving forward. On January 16th, 1979, the patent for the first self-flushing toilet was applied for. Somewhere in the late 1980s, they started to apply this technology to public restroom facilities. It is from that moment that I draw the decline of Western civilization. Most of us deal with any given technological innovation alone, with no opportunity to rise up against any perceived violation of civil liberty. For anyone of a certain age, there was a moment that everything changed. If you were born after 1990, you probably don't even imagine this might have been a startling innovation. But one day, you walk into a public bathroom, and there, instead of handles for flushing, there is a photoelectric device, an electric eye. And there you realize an electric eye is going to watch you pee. There is no chance that at that moment your head does not explode. Quickly, you reassure yourself that the device probably only needs to generally sense that there is a body somehow obstructing the passage of light in front of the sensor. But that is not the first place that your mind goes. And if your brain is anything like mine, the solving of this little electrophysical math problem does not actually relieve your discomfort in any significant way. Just because there is only so much information that electric eye actually needs to collect in order to function, does not mean that that same eye has been scrupulously calibrated to collect only that much information, nor have we any confidence that once this information is collected, it is somehow destroyed, washed away, flushed from the recorded index of history. This line of thinking takes us into the mind and motives of the inventor of these valves, and we do that little extra bit of math to realize that, well, if some pervy toilet engineer had set this rigmarole in place for the express purpose of taking a lurid gander at my private parts, then someone, somewhere along the line in the design, manufacture, regulatory, distribution, installation network would certainly have noticed and raised a red flag. But even if this were so, that does not mean that some freewheeling self-starter, some entrepreneurial engineer, inventor of mechanical devices could not find a way to disassemble said flushing meters and reassemble them with a video recording device and relay mechanism to upload photos of my special business in the midst of one of its most intimate processes to an unknown photo stream. Of course, the term photo stream had not been coined at that point, but if it had. So yes, eventually and ultimately, we dismiss this line of thinking as simple paranoid fantasy. Yet, it remains a paranoid fantasy that we cannot disprove. Once we have admitted the possibility of a renegade, free agent, disassembler of auto-flush valves, then we have to make the conscious decision, perhaps every time we step up to a urinal thereafter, that, well, okay, while this paranoid fantasy is theoretically possible, it is probably not true, at least in this given case. It is permissible, in spite of everything that we have been taught since childhood, to sacrifice that tiny portion of privacy and or dignity for the sake of going. Because sometimes you've simply got to go. And unmonitored going is not an option anymore. It is a Rubicon of sorts. And if we do not stop for this, then for what ultimately would we stop? Because once we have gone there, once we have sacrificed 100% surety that our personal uniqueness is not being transformed into the featured act of someone's distasteful fantasy, we have, to whatever tiny degree, released ownership. Our most intimate part, our most precious thing, might be living out a separate life somewhere out there in the cold and shriveling universe. Which means that, having accepted that the cameras in the bank are not so intimidating, at least by comparison. Which means the cameras in the 7-Eleven are not so problematical. Which means that the cameras in the hotel, no big deal. Which means that cameras in the elevator, the clothing store, the ATM, the toll booth, the traffic light, cameras in the school, the gas station, in your computer, on your cell phone, global positioning signals transmitted from your cell phone, cameras at the airport that take naked photos of you through your clothes, cameras in the sky, cameras in those drone things, cameras in the missiles projected from those drone things onto the heads of unfortunate pedestrians, zoom lens, ultraviolet, infrared cameras in those unmanned aerial vehicles. That's the preferred phrase. See-through imaging in those UAVs that sees through ceilings and walls by means of synthetic aperture radar. Drones in Yemen. Drones in Mexico to win the drug war. Drones that the Mesa County, Colorado Police Department obtained FAA permission to fly wherever they want to in the United States. Most of us naively assume that we are caught on camera perhaps 5-6 times per day. If you live in this city, you are caught on camera an average of 100 times per day. Once that number moves up, it does not go back down. In London, the average citizen is caught some 500 times per day. Of course, we'll never go that far. There are tribes in Africa, by the way, that do not allow you to take their picture. They believe it steals a piece of your soul. The Association for Unmanned Vehicle Systems International is a lobbying group that has a happy interest in seeing drones everywhere, pressuring states to open up corridors of drone-optional zones where drones may fly in naked delight through consenting skies. There are applications pending for drones to fly over football stadia, for drones to issue traffic tickets. Drones have mission creep. Creeps have mission drones. Drones can carry tear gas and any form of artillery you might wish to mention. Drones are the tools of cowards, the very sort who, back in the day of the wild, wild west, would have been publicly shamed and vilified for shooting a man in the back. So glad we've let go of that moral code. Drones can observe sex acts. Drones will, rest assured, observe sex acts. Drones will monitor people of unpopular color and will fly over peaceful protests with facial recognition software and will announce, throw down your weapon, you have 30 seconds to comply. Drones are perfect tools for the invasion of the airspace of sovereign nations, and isn't it good that in the history of mankind, no technology ever developed by a given country was ever matched or exceeded by another country who knew a good thing when they saw one, or who had the phone number of the manufacturer? Corporations are people, my friend. I traced the date back to January 16th, 1979. That was the moment that, to whatever tiny degree, we began the decline of Western civilization. Because once we have gone there, once we have sacrificed 100% certainty, then we have, to whatever tiny degree, released ownership. Somebody put it there. Somebody who has much more authority over such matters than I. Thank you. So I wanted to kind of at least get that into this conversation that we're having. And if you have questions on it, I'd love to address those. But hopefully you're tracing this back to the very beginning of what I started to say about having a conversation with yourself and finding things wrong about having that conversation. Back in the late 1980s, I started to have this weird idea about why are there no longer handles on the urinals or the toilets. And I could not stop my mind from going there, and I made myself totally wrong for having that conversation. But it was that conversation that manifested itself in what was eventually a 10-minute monologue / play. So, any questions now that you've had? Yes? How did I find my style? I don't know. I told jokes. I wrote things down. I wrote I've over the years, I have no idea, but I would say I've written a few million words on things. In this case, this particular piece is probably highly influenced by a performance artist by the name of Laurie Anderson. Has anyone heard of Laurie Anderson? Anyone? Kind of, maybe? Yeah. Laurie Anderson does these weird monologues where she has weird perspectives on things, and there's like a rhythm in her speech that I think I pick up to a slight degree as my character learns a thing and takes that to another conclusion and another conclusion. So I don't know if, and it's also my favorite. My heroes are always writers, and so when I think of the people who I feel the most powerfully about, it's not sports figures. It's Isaac Asimov. It's J.R.R. Tolkien. It's Kurt Vonnegut, Shakespeare, Molière. Molière has had a big influence on me just because I've dived so deeply inside his head over the years. But you work with these people, you appreciate their writing, and you absorb their way maybe to turn a phrase at some point, or to flip the switch on a script. For instance, this script, I didn't see the drones coming when I started out writing about electric eyes in the bathroom, but I got halfway through this script and I realized that as I was writing, as I was going through of where all of those cameras are now tracing us everywhere we go, I realized that that drones are the ultimate realization of that progress, and that there is something especially invasive about drones that I don't think we've addressed as a country, especially as we drop bombs in other countries uninvited. And so I think there's a moral sense that's kind of in an old-timey kind of moral sense, like the moment where I realized that in the Wild Wild West, you were a villain if you shot someone in the back, but isn't that kind of what we're doing? And so it's a balance. This idea against this idea. Do we still believe this idea anymore, or have we left that behind because this idea was better? So that's the conversation I find myself in all the time. You guys may have entirely different conversations going on in your head, but I guarantee you have conversations going on inside your head. of what it means to be a human being, what it means to think given thoughts, what it means to make certain choices. And we, as playwrights, throw people into situations where they need to make this choice or that and question why they do and whether that's a valid choice. Other questions? Yes?
So when you go through your everyday life, do you find yourself constantly jotting down these ideas? Like just...
I don't jot them down so much. What happens is all right, I'm going to talk political for just a second, is that I watch the things that are being done by the current administration in Washington, D.C., and it grows on me, and it grows on me, and it grows on me, and finally I have to dump it all into a Facebook post and talk about it. And sometimes it's a Facebook post, sometimes it's a tweet, sometimes it's a long play. It's not that. Sometimes I may be like, there's a thing here I need to touch upon, and I know I need to put it together, but I got to go to sleep now, or I've got to go rehearse lines now, or whatever it might be. So I do scratch something down from time to time, but it's like I feel like and I've been so busy this week. I did two performances of Lotto Shakespeare on Sunday and Monday. On Tuesday, I did a performance of Molière Than Thou remotely for a school in Tennessee. I drove here on Wednesday, and I've got 2 workshops and 2 performances of entirely different plays to be doing in the coming 2 days. So this last week, what's the outrage that's really been hitting me this week? It's the Supreme Court and the way that they're deciding that even if you've mailed your ballot in before Election Day, if it arrives after Election Day, it doesn't count, which is kind of a violation of what we believe elections are supposed to be. So those sort of things, they attach themselves to my soul, and I need to expiate them at some point. And so that's kind of what my life is like as a writer. And I think the more often I do that, the more often you do that, probably the more confidence you gather in terms of, I do have something to say about this. And I don't know how it's all going to go down on paper yet, but the process of transferring it to paper or to the computer is what's going to bring life to it and to sharpen it into a finely honed idea that people will go, yes, finally someone has said that. So that's kind of what I live for. Other questions? Yes?
Besides getting inspiration from what you see out in the world or what you take off from the news, are there any other bits of, like what you listen to the radio or other specific social media things that you take in your writing?
Yeah, I listen. I'm a news junkie. I get the Daily Kos newsletter every day, which has a dozen of the most popular essays that have gone up on Daily Kos for the day, and I usually look at a half dozen of those and read through them just to get a perspective from that point of view. I listen to Sam Cedars' Majority Report podcast as often as I possibly can. I watch The Young Turks at 5 o'clock most nights, and then in the evening it's Chris Hayes and Rachel Maddow and Lawrence O'Donnell, but I do those things when I'm doing mindless things on the computer. For instance, like transferring email addresses over from one document to another document, or putting out a series of emails that it's just a matter of me clicking a button again and again and again, that kind of thing. I don't like I can't write original material while I'm absorbing the news, because I can't even answer an email while I'm absorbing the news. But I can do that stuff while I'm in the middle of something mindless. I think if I'm reading that clock right, we're kind of running out of time. Anybody have any last minute question they want to ask? I hope this has been valuable for you. It's been me just kind of figuring out who I am and what I do in order to be a playwright, writing plays, engaging with life, and hopefully making a difference. I guess that's the final thing I'd like to leave you with, is that I do these things because I want to make a difference. I do Shakespeare because if you understand Shakespeare, you have access to one of the most brilliant minds of all time, and an understanding of mankind's emotions and experiences and balances and imbalances. I was doing that since, for a long, long time. And then I realized that all of that learning that I'm sharing with people and all the excitement that I'm giving them about Shakespeare or Moliere or the greatest speeches of all time is going to do them no good if the planet is on fire. And so I wrote this play about man cave because there's an urgency going on now that I think needs to be addressed. And so what I hope you understand is that I work from a mission-based point of view. I want to communicate something. I want people to understand something. I want to share something so that their lives will improve or so that they'll carry the message out somewhere else. I assume that you all have that same basic impulse towards self-expression of things that are very personal to you, whether it's the electric eye in the bathroom or your feelings about global warming. So, thank you for having me. I hope you come to see the show tonight and tomorrow. Have a great day. Thank you. Thank you very much.